on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
You had prairies all the way to the East Coast, including even on Long Island and the Canadian plains, way up into Manitoba, down into Mexico.
We have a lot of conversation in the foraging community about how much is appropriate to take. We'll hear a lot about how to minimize our impact, but we don't hear a lot about how to maximize our impact.
There were more prairie turnips when people were harvesting and eating them across the Great Plains than there are today. Because when traditional people dug that plant, they also scattered seeds.
The idea of having to relearn everything is so frustratingly painful to think about when knowledge exists right now, but it's not filtered into our world culturally.
No matter where we live, there are lands that need our help. If we plant this landscape and bring back what's there, we plant these plums and chokecherries and prairie turnips and harvest.
Episode 120 of the WildFed podcast, Prairie Restoration, Food, Medicine, and History with Kelly Kindscher, is brought to you by Surthrival. Why just survive when you could thrive? Surthrival.com is your source for nature-based nutritional supplements that keep you thriving in the modern world. From hormone health to immune support, increased metabolism to exercise recovery, Surthrival keeps you thriving when others are just surviving. Check out their pine pollen pure potency for testosterone support, colostrum for a smoothie ingredient that's 3 times more effective against the flu than vaccines, elk antler for powerful growth and recovery, medicinal mushrooms for immunomodulation and powerful antioxidant capability, and vitamin D3 for all the protective properties you've been hearing about during this pandemic. Go to surthrival.com to see the entire lineup and use the coupon code WildFed for 5% off your order. Surthrival. Why just survive when you could thrive? If you still haven't seen season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you can now stream all 10 episodes on demand at myoutdoortv.com. Myoutdoortv.com is Outdoor Channel's premium online subscription service. They host thousands of episodes of hunting and fishing content, making this a great subscription service for anyone interested in the outdoors. But if you just want to see WildFed, grab yourself a free trial subscription and then check out all 10 episodes at no charge. If you decide to keep it, it's just $9.99 a month. We're currently in production for season 2 of WildFed, which is shaping up to be an awesome season of new episodes, and they'll start premiering on the Outdoor Channel in 2022. Hey, thanks again for all your incredible support. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. I've got a great show for you today with Kelly Kindscher, Ph.D. He's the author of Edible Wild Plants of the Prairie, a senior scientist at the Kansas Biological Survey, and a professor in the Environmental Studies program at the University of Kansas. His research specialties are plant community ecology, conservation biology, restoration ecology, botany, and ethnobotany. His passion is for wild prairies, wild plants, and wild landscapes. If you've got questions about the ecology of the prairie, Kelly Kindscher is your guy. And I've got questions about the prairie. I love interviews like this that are deep dives on specific topics, especially getting to explore the big history of landscapes and their ecology. In our short lifetimes, we get such a brief glimpse into the places we live or visit. So drawing upon the incredible history and science to piece together a big picture story, to me, is both thrilling and revelatory. Today, of course, we're talking about the prairie, how it was formed, which most interestingly had a strong anthropogenic influence, and what happened from the first settlement there up to European contact and right up to the present. Having visited the prairie last year, not for the first time, but for the first time with intentionality, I'm keenly interested in this ecological treasure. And having eaten from what it provides in the form of bison, chokecherry, and prairie turnips, I really value the message that Dr. Kelly is sharing, that our prairie restoration efforts must include edible and medicinal plants if we hope to make a lasting change in how modern Americans relate to this crucial ecotype. Trying to rebuild it exclusive of people just means people forget about it. Out of sight, out of mind. But creating landscapes that humans can interact with, particularly at the gustatory level, which incidentally is the reason the prairies were built by humans in the first place, means that people, rather than forgetting, will instead be interacting. What we care about, we protect. It's a beautiful and timely message about a place whose importance can't be overstated. And of course, this same thinking can be applied to any and all landscapes. Like Kelly, I think tending wild landscapes for food and medicine is the missing component that gives modern people a reason to care. We already have the answers. They just need to be implemented. Dr. Kelly Kindscher, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Glad to be here.
Oh, I'm really happy to have you here today. I was watching a lecture of yours this morning, and I just got so excited about the work that you do. So wondering if you could start off maybe by telling us a little bit about yourself and where you work and what kind of stuff you do, your books and things like that.
Yeah, so I'm a researcher at the University of Kansas, and I have a passion for plants. I jokingly say I'm a jack of all plant trades. I'm trained professionally as a plant community ecologist, but ethnobotany has been my specialty. I just took a great interest in native plants, prairie plants, and then I wanted to learn about how they're used. And when you want to learn about how they're used for food and medicine, well, that means you take an interest in the people who were here before. So I've done a lot of study and have had interactions with many people across the plains, the Omaha, the Osage, Pawnee, Lakota, Dakota, Winnebago folks. And I've learned a lot, but I've learned even more by reading and studying and spending a lot of time outside. I've also done a lot of publishing, and most people know me for my edible wild plants of the prairie or my medicinal wild plants of the prairie. And I'm glad to say that after writing those 30 years ago, I'm now in the process of putting together new editions of both of those over the next couple, 3 years. So I'm adding more.
You came highly recommended to us by the forager Sam Thayer, and he's just sort of, for in the wild food community, I mean, he's just so highly regarded. So when he highly regards somebody, it's like, you should listen. And I just want to say thank you for the copy of Edible Wild Plants of the Prairie that you sent along, because this book is incredible. So very happy to have it in my hands. Could you describe a little bit for folks? I think a lot of the folks listening know, but let's talk about ethnobotany. What is it, and how is that kind of work conducted, and how is it useful to people today?
Yeah, so ethnobotany is literally the cultural study of plant uses. By that, I mean it is the study of groups of people and how they use plants. And we often think about it as, how Native Americans or how tribal people, but it doesn't have to be that. I've published ethnobotany on how Cambodian Vietnamese refugees garden in the U.S. and what plants they brought with them and what plants they want to use. I think the interest in ethnobotany is the details. How did people do things? How did they traditional do things? How did people do things with the tools or resources that they had originally? So it's a deep dive into that mix of culture and botany.
It's kind of interesting because when you say that, it makes me think, well, I guess in a sense, like we could look at, modern Americans making apple pie, and in a sense that's ethnobotanical. But it seems like a lot of when we use ethnobotany in kind of common parlance, like a lot of times we're looking back to a time before modern science, when everything between food and medicine and mythology was kind of blended together. Is that fair to say?
Yes. And then the great danger, and I still commit this and I'm apologetic, and oftentimes I'll say things like the Lakota use such and such plant, they use prairie turnips as food. And the truth of the matter is that oftentimes it's not past tense. The Lakota people are still using prairie turnips as food. So we kind of catch ourselves sometimes as not honoring the traditions that extend to today.
That's really interesting. I wasn't familiar with prairie turnip until this year as a food, but was given some braids of it on a visit to Standing Rock. And so have brought those back with me and had the opportunity to share in a traditional Dakota meal out there, and with bison and chokecherry and a lot of prairie turnip. And I'm actually planning to go back this year because I'd really like for our TV show to do an episode of, we make a wild food meal every episode, and I'm thinking prairie turnips and prairie dogs would be a fun episode to do.
Yes.
But I'm just really blown away by that plant. So it's something I'm interested in coming back to. Yeah, I did see that many people had braids of prairie turnip hanging in their
Hmm.
kitchens. And so
Hmm.
clearly this is something that's still being practiced, right?
Yes, yes, and I've done a lot of work with that plant, and there is sustainable harvest of it, which is good. And just to kind of enter this topic, uh, we've also published a grad student, Lisa Castle, who worked with me on the prairie turnip paradox. And that is that we believe that prairie turnips, which I like to call by their Lakota name, Tipson or Tipsonla, is not as common today because people don't dig it and eat it.
Mm.
Because when traditional people dug that plant, they also scattered seeds. They replanted it as they dug it and they created soil disturbance. And so I actually believe that there were more prairie turnips when people were harvesting and eating them across the Great Plains in larger numbers than there are today.
This is one of these things that, as a forager, has really bothered me because we have a lot of conversation in the foraging community about how much is appropriate to take, but we tend not to. So, okay, that's good. We're trying not to create a deficit, but how do we build that bank account up beyond, into surpluses? And that's that tending the wild component that you don't get as much about. So, for instance, out here where
Yes.
something like ramps might be really popular
Yeah,
to forage, we'll hear a lot about how to minimize our impact, but we don't hear a lot about how to maximize our impact. So maybe you could just say a little bit more about that, because I think it's like we're never getting past zero into the pluses. We're like always working
that's
in these
right.
deficit
That's right.
numbers with foraging.
And ramps are a great one because, wow, that's a plant you can divide and spread, or you can collect seeds and spread. And we need to make that part of our practice and work that we do as foragers. In fact, that needs to be part of the foraging package. Native Americans had that wrapped into even their harvest. You return something, you give an offering, and that often meant you put the plant back in the hole, which in the case of prairie turnips, return seeds to where you
Mm.
dug it. So we need to think of these things as return and offering, and we need to talk about them. I think that's part of the problem too. People just see the harvest, and even when there's people that are conscious and actually helping propagate or distribute things, that's not given enough attention. And of course, we all squirm and know it's wrong when people just go out and pillage and dig things up and kill plant material inadvertently or even purposefully. We know that's wrong, but we need to get this movement that really wants to have people engaged in this. And we need to move that engagement from pristine wild places into restoration projects. In fact, I think the greatest opportunity for this replanting, propagating, and then harvest is in landscapes we need to restore. So we need to be putting these plants back in forests as they are regenerating, back in prairies as we restore them. And those are the best places for people to go reharvest because there's not going to be complaints about someone digging up, a beautiful prairie or working in the hollows and, making a mess of things. If it's out in lands we're restoring, I think people will begin to see that it truly is an addition.
I want to come back to that in a moment because it's in the lecture that I was watching this morning. You were talking a lot about restoration efforts and the sort of systemic lack of wild edible plants and medicinal plants that get worked into those restoration projects. So I want to talk about that. But for a moment, I'd like to just focus on this idea of disturbance because it's interesting to me that many of the plants that we prize as foods do really well when humans disturb the
Yeah.
landscape. So, could you speak to that a little bit? Like, what does that mean? And botanically speaking, like, why does that work so well? And how do we really take
Mhm.
advantage of the fact that everywhere? Because I ask this because it's such a big picture question. Because right now there's this effort to sort of this idea that humans are just bad for the landscape
Uh-huh.
because of the damage we do. And I think, like, yes, we can be, but also we do disturbances that can be really good for the landscape when they're
Mhm.
strategic. So, could you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great topic, by the way. There's a lot of books that are just titled Eat the Weeds. So it's recognized that a lot of our wild foods and wild medicines are weedier species or earlier successional species often annuals, often plants that are just adapted to soil disturbance. In a natural environment, of course, that occurred in floodplains, that occurred where there were animal disturbances by bison or elk or even deer, where you had ground disturbance due to any sort of factor. That is a really good place for these weedier species. In restoration efforts, primarily we want to get the charismatic flora that's maybe more difficult. So you want the prairie wildflowers that are more difficult to grow. Or if we're thinking about forests, we think less about the understory and more about getting the trees established. And actually, a lot of these species that we're talking about that we use as food are those early successional plants. So they fit right in with disturbance, and they also give us an opportunity, particularly in urban, suburban fringe areas. Unfortunately and fortunately, there's lots of disturbance. There's lots of these plants around.
You just said something about how a lot of these are plants that we value for food resources are early successional. And that's something that comes up for me when you say that, is that many of the peoples we've been discussing, indigenous folks to the continent here, that many of their methods involved sort of large scale disturbances to reset succession. Is that fair to say? Like burning, for instance, in a way that would reset succession. And as a follow up to that, is there a place for that kind of management today? Do you think that that's lacking, or do you think that we actually have to do alternative techniques in order to create that kind of early succession if we want to see it?
Yeah, we definitely need to encourage what I would call as light disturbance over many of our environments and heavier disturbance over some. So specifically, really pristine, really nice forests, nice prairies would benefit from light disturbance. And that disturbance could be fire. It could be very light grazing, ideally with no fencing on the site, but something that would allow for some of these seeds to get established, both the weedy species, and it also allow for some of the more pristine species. For a lot of our landscape, though, we really now need fairly intense disturbance, but of the right sort. We need fire over much of our landscape. We probably need less grazing. I'm not saying we should necessarily decrease the amount of acres that are grazed, but we should have less grazing. We're still seeing biodiversity reductions under most cattle grazing, and that's a shame. We know that there's a place for large herbivores, but if there's just too much impact by them, especially eating, but also hoof action, we get biodiversity decreases. And it's particularly the conservative species, that is the species that are more likely to be uncommon or rare, that tend to decrease. So we need a mix of things. We need careful thought about land management and different techniques in different places. So it's not a one size fit all operation. We need to really be thinking about it. And it makes me squirm on the national level when we see that responses to forest fires are, on one hand, don't burn anything, the other hand, to logging. We need some middle ground. We
Okay,
need to have
what does that look
fire
like?
across the landscape.
Managed fire across the landscape. Is there any,
Yeah.
in your experience working in the restoration field, is that on the horizon, or is that still way outside the scope of what land managers are thinking about?
So there's not enough of it, but most prairie restoration, and there's not enough prairie restoration, but most of it does include fire. And some people include a grazing component early on, but fire is regularly used in prairie restoration. It's viewed as important to helping the ecosystem develop with more diversity. So that's recognized, just it's not on enough acres yet. We're now seeing an increase in fire used on rangeland habitats, and we're also seeing more wildfires on rangeland habitats, some of which are actually fairly destructive.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some concern there, much like the western forests. Um, Most of those fires in western forests are actually good for the ecosystem. But when you hear of the crown fires, where you hear of that, landscapes have been denuded, Well, that's where fire's too intense, and where really you needed to have a fire many years ago in those landscapes.
It occurs to me because I think sometimes we're guilty as culturally as thinking of the landscape as pristine without people. And,
Hmm.
this North American landscape, you think since the last glacial maximum, it's been like populated by people. So you would think that just the action of people burning firewood for their camps
Yeah,
would
yeah.
have reduced the amount of fuel on any given landscape so significantly as to prevent these really large scale fires. And are these out of control large scale fires a result of there just being too much fuel left behind because people aren't moving through and utilizing it? Or I don't know if there's really a
Yeah,
question there, but does that make sense?
there's a mix of things. So historically, and this is particularly interesting in prairies, we really don't have a history of prairies in the United States that are absent from humans.
Mm-hmm.
So humans uh, came into the prairie region 10, 15,000 years ago as the glaciers were retreating, and they were using fire. Um, they used fire for campfires and cooking, as you mentioned, and they gathered firewood for that. But also, those campfires were a source of wildfires. So Native Americans had fires that escaped too from campfires. I think there's always been kids who've played with fire,
Yeah.
matches
Yeah.
or whatever, right?
I was one of them. Yeah.
And occasionally those fires get away. And fires were also used to uh, burn the grass so the bison would come back in. Fires were also used for warfare in places. So the landscape was burned. And in some ways, the landscape, at least for the whole center part of the country, has been managed by people, by Native Americans for a long, long time. And we find more and more looking in the forests in the east and out west that fires there were both set by lightning and by humans.
Mm.
So we actually have a long history of those fires. What we're seeing today, though, is we've had a long period of absence of fires, and we've had both increases in more flammable species in density and size.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So, like in the prairie country, we're getting a lot more invasion by junipers, and those junipers are really flammable, and they create a cram fire. And we also have more and more big storms. So we're entering the fire season. You're going to hear of fires in the Great Plains again because there's drought going on, and we'll have a dry spring with winds at times of 50, 60, 80 miles per hour. There was a fire in Kansas this year with winds that gusted to 80 or 90 miles per hour, jumped highways, burned itself out eventually with some help, but for the most part, it was unstoppable until it reached crop fields, wheat fields that were green or not full of vegetation. So again, there's a mix of things. Unfortunately, the landscape and ecology and human uses are pretty complex.
As you're talking, I want to actually go back to something you just said and then kind of ask a bigger picture question. But it sounds like from what you just said and some of the things I've been reading that there's at least the implication that the prairie exists because of human land management, that it's not necessarily like the natural occurrence in the absence of humans. And so I'm curious if you could speak to that, but also going back a little bit further, could we get historical context on how the prairie came to be? And, as glaciers retreated, can you give us a little bit of a sort of geological background that forms the prairie?
Yeah.
And then maybe walk us through to today, what the state of it is today. And because quite a lot's happened from when Europeans arrived on the landscape, particularly, I think the introduction of the horse had just a tremendous impact on the prairie. And then, of course, westward expansion, all these kind of things. So could you kind of give us like a big picture overview of the prairie itself as we know it?
Yes. Yes.
We'll get right back to the show in a moment. But first, hunting is as ancient as humanity itself. And through most of our history, it wasn't just a physical pursuit, but it was also a spiritual one. It was one of the ways human beings came to understand ourselves and how to reverently approach the animals that would come to sustain us. Hunting is still an incredible tool for personal transformation, helping you discover more about yourself, your environment, the animals you share the world with, and even helping you develop a deeper understanding of life and death itself. Hunting can help you find your place in the community of life. But you could hunt all your life and never find that kind of transformation. It takes deliberate practice, awareness, and sometimes even initiation. That's why my friend Monsell Denton created Sacredhunting.com. Sacredhunting brings new or experienced hunters out onto the landscape to stalk, harvest, and field dress animals in a retreat-type setting in conjunction with sweat lodges, plant medicine ceremonies, and strong intention setting that prepares hunters for a lifelong spiritual relationship with themselves, the land, and the animals they hunt. Last time I was in Texas for a hunt, Monsell came out to hold ceremony for me as a way of deepening the experience, creating more reverence for the land, and of course, as a way of honoring the animals we'd be harvesting. That's the piece that's so often missing in modern hunting, a piece that many hunters would like to restore. If this is what you're after or you want to learn more, check out Sacredhunting.com. Monsell and his team will guide you through beginner hunts, and more experienced hunters will find unique opportunities available across the country and globe, like axis deer hunts on Molokai in Hawaii, and even a northern Siberia hunt with the Nenets people coming up in 2022. There's only a few spots available for each hunt, so go to Sacredhunting.com and complete their 2-minute application. Discounts are available if you let them know you heard about them on the WildFed podcast. Again, go to Sacredhunting.com, and you can learn more about Monsell and Sacred Hunting on episode 59 of the WildFed podcast. Now, back to the show.
So we do believe and have good evidence that for at least the northern half, 2/3 of the Great Plains and Midwest, that you had literally aspens and spruce trees being the dominant vegetation, let's say 30,000 years ago.
Okay.
And somewhere around 20 to 15,000 years ago, it started warming up. And during that time, you had grasses and prairie species that had been in refugia, been in places where they were protected from some of the cold, as close as the Ozarks, southern plains in Texas, southwestern deserts, and even into Mexico. And as things warmed and those tree species could not do as well, the aspen and spruce were in retreat, and the prairies started increasing, and humans came into the picture there. Native Americans came into the picture at some place. There were some natural fires, there were human set fires, and these prairie species over time, over hundreds and thousands of years really, moved and reoccupied the region, so that you had prairies actually in some places all the way to the East Coast, including even on Long Island, where there was, a now extinct prairie chicken population, but especially into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Prairie State, Iowa, up into Michigan a little bit, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and then the Canadian plains, way up into Manitoba and Alberta, west all the way to the Rocky Mountains, down into Mexico, where there's still a semi-free-ranging bison herd in Chihuahua with prairie dogs. So then jumping much fast forward, you had Native Americans living on the landscape. Most Native Americans, though, used wild resources, but also grew corn, beans, and squash. The dominant thing was that there was growing of crops or harvesting of wild foods that was moved into. And then with the beginnings of European invasion of the New World.
Can I ask a quick question first?
Yeah.
So prior to this European introduction of European peoples and their plants and animals on the landscape, were the deep prairies, something I've read a bunch is that the deep prairies were not before the horse, very accessible, or that they could almost be dangerous places to venture too deeply into. So is there much evidence of human occupation in the deep prairie, or were humans sort of excluded? And then what led to the tremendous amounts of topsoil that were present there?
Yeah. I did skip over that. So in terms of geologic processes, prior to the spruce and aspen, you had drought cycles, you had glacial cycles, and the glacial melt had tremendous amounts of dust, and you had tremendous dust storms. So the dust and the dust storms in areas like the Sandhills in Nebraska and all these badland areas out west, the topsoil blew and blew and created very, very deep soil. So that, for instance, where I grew up in Nebraska, there was 5 and 10 feet of
Wow.
topsoil. Much of Iowa is covered by many, many feet of topsoil. Just incredible. In fact, where I grew up, I didn't realize rock was part of the landscape. We had some Pleistocene gravels and sand, but there was no rock anywhere near around where I grew up, within miles. So I just thought the landscape should be soil everywhere,
Wow.
which it's not. So,
Yeah.
so the prairies are blessed and adapted to deep soil, although obviously some species like rock outcrops and poorer soil too, but the prairies overall function well with that soil, and prairie species help improve the soil. So the
Right.
great soils of our farming belts in Iowa and Illinois, Nebraska, this whole region are the combination of this great soil resource, but also the legacy of prairie species whose grasses' roots create tremendous amounts of organic matter, much
Okay.
of which has been essentially evaporated or volatilized by modern farming practices and replaced with chemical fertilizer. But we still have that legacy and still have tremendous amounts of organic matter. So
Okay.
that
Yeah.
soil
Wow.
is a big, big picture. Um, Let me address one other thing there. Don't forget, the entire plains were occupied. You had
Okay.
many waves of people living in different places. You had corn growing people clear out in the high plains at times.
Okay.
Um,
Wow.
and then you'd get drought spells and people would have to relocate and move. Um, but there was wild food harvest and crop production across the entire plains.
Okay. What would you say would be at that time, again, prior to Europeans, like where I live in Maine, we didn't get maize didn't make its way here till I think
Yeah.
about 4,000 years ago. So it took a lot longer. When did they start agricultural or at least gardening their horticulture in the plains? And then um, what were the most important of, I would imagine, the prairie turnip, the choke cherry, the camas, but like what were the most important plant
Yeah.
species there?
So the corn was actually more recent in terms of Great Plains, probably 2,000 years. And
Oh wow.
cultivation of most crops really has been within that last 1,000 or 2,000 years. Um, so we're still uncovering a lot, but there in the southern plains there was definitely pit baking, much like people do with agave or camas in the northwest.
Hmm.
So they found these pit baking places where there might be a big pit, like 10, 15 feet across, hot rocks, root vegetables put in there, covered with green material, more hot rocks, cover the whole thing with soil, and come back in 3 days or stay around and party for 2, 3 days, and then
Yeah.
open it up, and you get these great, tasty sweet potato tasting like roots, which the slow cooking turns more of the heavy carbohydrates into sugars,
Hmm.
which made those wonderful. But in many places in the plains, you had wild harvest of not just prairie turnips, but lots of seeds and even grass seeds. And that culture mostly disappeared. But you had a lot of seed gatherers, and of course, people did hunt game, bison, and any game was hunted. But
Sure.
people
Antelope,
always
I
needed
imagine.
carbohydrates.
Hmm. Yeah,
Go
it's
ahead.
funny. It's funny today to see in my own lifetime, just experimenting with nutrition. I've always been really interested in food, and when I was younger, there was always this push in the health food world around vegetarianism, and then eventually veganism became very popular. And after a while, it just doesn't gel with anthropology. It's like, hey, we don't see that. How can that be
Mhm.
right? And then
Mhm.
now we're seeing this like carnivore diet approach. I'm sure you hear a lot about that. It's like folks going completely off plants and being like, no, you should only eat animals. And I just find it like, again, when you look at the anthropology, it's like,
Yeah.
we don't find that anywhere, not even in the Arctic. This doesn't make sense. Like the importance that these plants played in people's lives just is tremendous.
Yes, very much so. And as a little aside, I had a grad student approach me, and we wrote about Neanderthals diet in Europe. And of course, just being really, if you think about it, racist. We view Neanderthals these kind of stupid pre-humans that lived off of meat. Well, there's quite a bit of record that they also gathered a lot of food and needed carbohydrate. Humans
Right.
can't live off of just protein.
Yeah.
So, so I think in some respect, we're kind of coming full circle and realizing that people have always needed or wanted carbohydrates. In fact, in more recent history with horses and all the buffalo hunting out west in the plains, the Lakota and other Siouan people were still trading for corn, beans, and squash. So part of their routine is that they traded for those carbohydrate foods that were harder to obtain.
Yeah, I don't think maybe it's not a sexy enough title, but I just want somebody to write the Omnivore Diet. It's like
Yes,
when do we
yes,
get that? But yeah, I was looking through your chapter on the prairie turnip, and you were mentioning that there was like a sort of a standard trade for prairie turnip for shelled corn. And I think what that came out to be was like 4 braids of
yeah,
prairie turnip was worth about the equivalent of a bison hide, which,
yes,
knowing how much work goes into processing a bison hide, I just thought that was a pretty high. These are high value items for people, carbohydrates, right? It's like,
yes,
today
yes.
we take it for granted because we live in this carbohydrate saturated environment where we actually have to be careful about our intake because we become obese. But this is only in the last 100 years that it was possible to be obese like this, right?
Yeah, we are in crazy times that way. It was first very exciting to see these trading that was done. In that case, it was with the Arikara tribe in the northern plains. But to see these trading amounts, and you're absolutely right, is that modern culture has, in some sense, abused carbohydrates, refined them so much, not just white flour, white, rice, but now, high fructose corn syrup, right? I mean,
Right.
that's a carbohydrate source that people consume way too much of. And so because of that, you get these interests in, well, maybe we should just eat meat, right? Let's get away from that.
Too
And yet
far.
we do need this balanced diet. And then of course those of us who are truly interested in foraging, well, you also want all these green foods, all
Yeah.
these things that have healthy properties, that make teas and food and medicine, that whole mix of things. And so we want now really that diversity. We want that diversity of diet.
That's another good book title, The Diversity Diet. Uh,
There we go.
so
Yes.
so when Europeans arrive, how long does it take them to start accessing? I mean, I imagine coming to the plains was just mind blowing to encounter that, and then especially coming from the eastern woodlands and originally from Europe. How long does it take for them to start getting out there, and when do Europeans start to have an impact on what's happening on the plains? I think by the time they're really getting there, horses have made their way up from the south, so that's had a
Yes.
tremendous impact too. So, what happens post contact?
Yeah, so really the first entry into the plains was from the south. Spaniards coming in from Mexico, Coronado in 1540. But after that, with the Spaniards being pushed back, but then coming in again, horse culture was brought in, and then lots of horses became wild. And so in the 1600s, wild horses were a thing. Native folks learned about horses from the Spaniards, but soon adopted the horse as an amazing animal that in many cases replaced a culture they already had. Is that many tribes had used dogs to move good in trades. Dogs actually pulled uh, travois, little I can't even call them carts, but two sticks with
Like carts without the
hide
wheels.
between them.
Yeah.
Yeah, they didn't have the wheel, but they drug these, two long sticks with hide between them, which you could carry some weight in to help move villages or help them on their bison hunts. So they already had involved animals in some movement, And in some ways, the horse was just a much bigger and more talented dog for helping move goods. And then, of course, they learned and developed really fabulous hunting skills. I mean, we all know about, people shooting arrows on the back of a horse, hanging onto it with their legs,
No
and being
saddle.
very effective at hunting in
Unbelievable.
that fashion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, please continue.
So,
It's just incredible to me.
but at the same time, you had those sort of things come up from the south. Then you had the French first. The French were first out on the plains after the Spaniards came up from the south, and then later it was the English and others. By the time Lewis and Clark came up the Missouri River in 1804-05, they were meeting French trappers, traders who were coming down rivers from the west with loads of pelts of beaver and other furs that had great value in Europe. There were trade goods that the native folks already had. I just read a passage where, in those times, one of the explorer parties coming up the Missouri River met one of the tribes, I think it was the Hidatsa, and bargained with them for 500 pounds of corn. And they didn't
Wow.
know this trade was going to occur. They just happened to have extra 500 pounds of corn. I
Wow.
mean, so these native folks were growing tremendous amounts of corn,
Right.
which they used and traded, and then developed more of that for trading.
Wow. And then when did the plains start to be changed from what they had, how they had been maintained by these tribal folks, to where Europeans started to have a significant impact on that landscape?
Well, I think the first thing is with the interactions, there was immediate warfare. You had lots of people killed in warfare, and you had disease. There's still some debate on whether smallpox was deliberately encouraged or not. I think that's a topic that needs more research. But in any case, smallpox diminished populations of tribes, in some cases by 60, 80%.
Yeah.
And with that, you had tremendous cultural dislocation. You also had firepower in the invaders, and what could Native people do? I mean, there was no bargaining when
Right.
you're at the end of a gun, so to speak. So they were dispossessed, pushed around, dispossessed, culture taken, herded onto reservations. I mean, and that all started really, I mean, with Lewis and Clark, which was a military expedition. I mean, we frame that differently in our history, but it was a military expedition.
Okay.
And after that fact, the rush was on, and then it greatly increased after the Civil War. That's when complete change of the landscape occurred, and the landscape was opened up for settlers.
Who immediately began farming it with. Yeah, because one thing I've wondered a long time about is, were they immediately planting European crops, or at what point did they start to grow maize as well?
Yeah, maize was a big piece of the settlement.
Okay.
So corn had been viewed and learned about by folks clear on the East Coast. And so by the time the plains were being settled, corn was the first crop of choice.
Okay.
And wheat varieties, European wheat varieties, didn't work very well. In fact, there's great history of Mennonites introducing hardy Ukrainian wheats into Kansas in the 1870s. So soon after settlement, but not beginning with settlement. So
Okay.
corn was the first crop, not the only crop, but corn was one of the first crops that many settlers grew. Corn,
Okay.
wheat, oats, um, little pasture ground or things for cattle, livestock, milk cows. All of that was part of the package.
Okay, so they bring in the cattle as well. I mean, that must have just had, and this is at the same time that the bison herds are being reduced down, by both Europeans and by native peoples, right? And then eventually the hide hunters coming in. and kind of taking out the last of those bison as they're filling it in with I always see it written, the speckled cattle when I
Yes,
read
and
the old writing, but that's all kind of happening simultaneous with this.
not quite. I mean, so you definitely had the bison being removed ahead of settlement. Um, and more of it was done by bison hunters than Native Americans, although Native Americans were involved in some of that. But it literally became extermination of bison. I
Hmm.
mean, in probably the largest numbers were not used as food. They were just
Right.
killed.
Right.
Maybe
Yeah.
tongues were taken out of some, which tongues were shipped back east, but mainly it was just elimination of them, seemingly government policy to get rid of the bison because that would end the Indian Native American culture that had existed for a long time.
And can you describe to us the impact, the different impact? I imagine there's like two things going on. Both are bovids, but there's different hoof action, different lifestyle between bison and cattle. And then I imagine also the cattle would have been more restricted in their movement too, which must have had an impact. But like how do you think
Yeah.
of bison versus cattle on the prairie?
Yes. Well, I think the critters are probably more similar than different. Bison are bigger and have perhaps a more beneficial impact. I really think that the biggest change has been that the intensity of grazing has grown, I'd say, almost exponentially. Um, when you really have bison, we don't know that they were at carrying capacity. We don't know that the whole
Right.
landscape was occupied, and it probably wasn't. For one thing, bison had to live 24/7 year round based on natural water sources.
Yeah.
And if there's a drought, bison would move on or die, and that doesn't mean that they repopulate quickly. I mean, most bison cows have one calf, per year.
Right.
Um, and not all of them would have calves. I mean, so it would take a while to see repopulation, and there's great debate about bison. How many were there? Um, I think it's somewhat of a myth. I don't think the bison had great migrations. There's not evidence of that before the herds were being greatly diminished. Um,
Interesting.
I think they were pretty much resident and definitely
Right.
more common in the central plains, western plains than in the east, but they were throughout the region. And there's just not history of bison migrating to Illinois or north to south in the plains
Yeah.
until the railroads were being pushed through and at that period of time. But that we
Okay.
had so much cultural disruption by then that it's really hard to get a take on how that worked. Bison are within them, though, are better on the landscape in terms of diversity. They eat a higher percentage of their diet of grasses and less wildflowers or forbs. So they're much more selective in that respect. And they're don't hang out as much in just stream courses and waterways. They actually, believe it or not, walk a lot further than cows. I mean, they would graze hilltops and places far away from water because they were much more adapted to all that. Cows really did evolve, as we know them now with humans and depend on human care. So it was quite a transition, but probably more in husbandry and grazing intensity
Mm.
than in species.
I have a funny piece of video footage we recorded in South Dakota. We were with Ron Brown Otter. He's got the largest native-owned bison herd in the country, and he used to raise cattle and switched over to
Uh-huh.
bison because his a lot of his cattle were dying in the cold. He was losing a lot of his herd. And we were asking him how they were different, and he was like, "Well, cows are lazy. He's like,
Yeah,
they just
yeah,
sit around in the same place. These bison are moving so much every day and carrying seed from one place to another, and they're not putting too much impact in any one place." He's like, "My cows would just wallow in one
yeah,
spot all day."
yeah,
So between this period we just talked about and those dust bowls
yeah,
that I always hear about, I would love to kind of
yeah,
understand what happened and how severe the impact on that ecosystem was.
yeah. It's not talked about enough, but the Great Dust Bowl in the 1930s was part of climate change. We don't look at it that way, but we know the Dust Bowl was at least in part induced by us humans. And there's now been some studies looking at how the Dust Bowl became so bad. And it was this combination of factors of human use of the landscape that created climate change. So, but it was so severe. We've not had a period of weather quite like that. Still, to this day, the highest summer temperatures in Kansas and Nebraska for the whole year go back to the Dust Bowl times. There's been no hotter temperatures than occurred in the Dust Bowl. We've also not had anywhere near as severe a drought since then, which really makes it scary thinking about the future.
Yeah.
But it was so bad in a lot of these areas, and particularly further west in the sandy soils into New Mexico, eastern Colorado, Oklahoma, West Texas, that these sandy soils and the drought was harder in the southwest part of the plains blew. And so you had tremendous dust storms. And of course, there's accounts of dust in the air in New York City and out to sea that was from the Great Plains. You had dust drifts in places, especially on fence rows where mailboxes would be covered under soil, where things disappeared, where landscapes were denuded. In fact, it was considered ruined. And because of that, there was tremendous economic collapse. I mean, you had not just people going bankrupt, but you had literally banks going bankrupt. And, the economy is failing. And so the federal government did rush in, help prop some things up, and took over lands. So we have national grasslands throughout the West that are primarily because the government was the last entity to be able to hang on to them. That the whole system of land ownership had failed because of such terrible human-induced weather situation. Those national grasslands, though, what's interesting today, are well vegetated, and areas around them are back in crop production. We really don't see tremendous amounts of landscape degradation that has persisted over the last 90 years now. Among other things that helped, and maybe help cover that up, is that post Dust Bowl was also the time when we really developed the ability to make commercial fertilizer.
I mean, that was all war effort stuff, right? That was like
that's right.
Chemical
so the war,
production in the war.
Yes, that's right. And it was, fertilizers related to bomb making. I mean, think about Tim McVeigh, but there's this long history of the nitrogenous compounds being made for bombs, but also similar processes using most of the same technology used for commercial fertilizer. And that fertilizer then was used all across the country, but in areas in the West where soils have been degraded, it brought them back and actually increased productivity. Much like most of the Midwest, which wasn't nearly as impacted, but yields of corn, wheat, all these grain crops in Iowa and everywhere has increased. And I think the biggest factor has been the ability to maximize the use of fertilizer, along with, of course, modern genetics, and that makes use of that added nutrients to increase crop yields.
When you say dust, are we talking about dry soil? Is this actually topsoil that was blowing around and blowing away?
It was a combination of things, and it's now believed that much of it did come out of sands. So much of it was what we wouldn't think is typically topsoil, but the sandy areas in the Southwest lost the organic matter and clay particles. A lot of it's clay.
Very fine.
If you think about organic matter, it's going to be a little less likely to be airborne because it's going to be just about your garden. It's not just compost, but it's more like compost. And a lot of what was in the air was more on the clay side.
Right. Electrically charged particles, really, too.
Yes.
Okay, so that all blows around. We take bomb making materials and dump that back into the plains. That, things start to become productive again, and then take us up to the modern era. And what's the state of the plains now, particularly, I guess, from a soil perspective, but also from a biodiversity perspective? Where are we at
Yeah.
today?
Well, we've hammered the system. It's really pretty sad, and we've continued to have the onslaught of chemicals. I mean, so almost all that landscape, the majority of the landscape that's prairies, now get chemical herbicides applied to them along with fertilizer because most of that landscape is now in till agriculture.
GMO
Um,
crops that
yep,
that are
yep,
tolerant to glyphosate and chemicals like it.
yep, yep. Yep.
Ugh.
And now we're seeing irrigation on huge amounts of acreage, which we know is not sustainable, but that's where we're at right now.
Okay.
Um, but I guess I have to say a couple positive things about the place we're in. Remarkably, we've lost very few species. So, in terms of our plant biodiversity, there are very few species that have been lost since white settlement. A few, but not many. Now, numbers have increased, numbers have decreased dramatically across the plains,
Mm-hmm.
but very few things have been lost. And looking forward, we have such tremendous opportunity for storing carbon in Great Plains soils. So
Ah.
we've burned up a third or half of the organic matter in those soils. They are ripe to farming systems that actually build organic matter back. And we know how to do that. It may not be the most productive in terms of crop production, but we do know how to do that. And planting prairies and diversity is part of that picture. So we have tremendous opportunities to help with climate change by restoration, by replanting biodiversity, by doing good things.
What who's behind the what's the scope and scale of the restoration projects that are happening now and on the horizon? Who's behind that, and what's the opposition and obstacles that we face in doing that? Because it must be a very complicated
Yeah.
socio-political kind of environment to operate in.
Well, I think the main thing lacking is will and direction of financial resources. And again, a note of optimism, we are pumping tremendous amounts of money from the federal government in agricultural operations right now.
Yeah.
So we just need to tweak that money going out, and we would begin to create very positive change. We now subsidize things like ethanol. We subsidize farmers for growing the crops they grow. They wouldn't grow what they grow except
Yeah.
for federal money. I
Right.
mean, so we can actually change that. In terms of restoration, the biggest amount of acreage that has been somewhat restored is actually USDA's Conservation Reserve Program lands, which started out primarily to take land out of production, to rest land because we were producing too much food and there was no market for it,
Oh wow.
and secondarily to help slow down soil erosion, especially on marginal soils. So the program is targeted marginal soils. And this has been going on for 30, 40 years. Originally, only 5 species of grasses were planted. But over the last couple decades, the program has changed, and now there's 15, 20 species that are planted, including pollinator species. You get points in your bid by really promoting more biodiversity. It's still a weak program. Like, we're not planting prairie turnips, we're not planting useful plants that us foragers would love to see. Um, but there's a start there, and there's a program that's there. Then we have really, really small programs by many nonprofits, everything from Missouri Prairie Foundation in Missouri to Prairie Plains Resource Institute in Nebraska that are planting highly diverse prairie restorations, collecting local seeds, local genotype seeds, planting maybe 100, 150 species
Oh yeah,
when they do
cool.
their restorations, with many of the species that I really like, So we're seeing that on a very, very small scale, but it's recognized that there's lots of merit to that approach.
One of the things I loved that you were talking about in this lecture I watched was, and it just really gels with why I do what I do. Is I've experienced that when somebody gets out on a landscape and then utilizes what's there as food or medicine, their interest in protecting and conserving that landscape increases so dramatically versus
Yep.
a landscape they've never visited, or maybe they visited but it's only ever been the stage upon which they do their sport or something, but it's never been interactive place for them. um,
Yes.
the way you were talking about prairie restoration, you were really emphasizing the importance of food and medicine plants, which is beautiful because you're tying together this ethnobotany with modern people, with
Yes.
conservation, with restoration. So I want to just give you some space to talk about that because
Yes.
I really appreciated that perspective.
Well, no matter where we live, there are lands that need our help and care, and we need to look at them as places to interact. So this great bringing together of this need as humans to caretake, and this need for humans for food and medicine, and of this great need right now to do something related to climate change. It just seems that restoration of local habitats to what they were originally and bringing that diversity back. I mean, we're in a market change. When the restoration movement started, it kind of was like, oh, we should plant a bunch of seeds and we better fence this area, and keep people out so it can, really become this great nature. And now we've learned so much, and so many people are writing about it. Kat Anderson's work in California, and Robin
That's tending the
Kimmerer's
wild.
Braiding Sweetgrass. Yes, all
Mm-hmm.
these books repeatedly educate us on ways that we as humans should and want to interact with nature for
Mm-hmm.
food and for connection. And there's definitely a very strong spiritual connection in doing that. I mean,
Yeah.
one of the things that has delighted me during the pandemic is the number of people that are out on trails, the number of people that are now gardening, the number of students at my school that expressed interest in ethnobotany and gardening and food production and permaculture and all these topics. It's increased a lot. So there's this need to do this. And so we need to create more venues for people being engaged in these restoration projects and then bringing that forward. I think there's nothing better than saying, hey, if we plant this landscape and bring back what's there, and we plant these plums and chokecherries and prairie turnips, well, we could grow those and harvest them and replant them. And you
Yeah.
could get your medicines. You could get your echinacea. You can get some mint tea. All these things. We can plant them, tend them a little, manage that landscape with fire or whatever it needs, and harvest. And if we harvest sustainably, especially in habitats that we as humans have helped recreate, I just think the connections and the value of that is tremendous.
Can you tell me what role First Nations people here, Indigenous folks here, play or could play in this? Because it feels like there's this fundamental disconnect, unfortunately,
Hmm.
culturally,
Hmm.
between these restoration efforts often being kind of government run, and then Native people being sovereign on their land. It's like there's like a disconnect there, and then also, what's the state in your experience of remembered knowledge from the past? Because I
Hmm.
worry as generations go on, the idea of having to relearn everything is so frustratingly painful to think about when knowledge exists right now, but it's not filtered into our world culturally. So yeah, like you've worked a lot with tribal peoples here on the
Hmm.
ethnobotany. Is are those voices reaching outward yet, or is it difficult to access, or I don't know
Yeah.
if you can pick that apart for me.
Yes, that's also a difficult topic. Well, I think first just have to acknowledge that we did incredible damage to
Hmm.
native cultures. So
Hmm.
much so that most of them not only lost almost all their land, but they lost almost all their language.
Hmm.
And if you don't have your language, it's also hard to remember well the traditional stories, the traditional methods, traditional foods. The traditions have suffered greatly. So that's where we stand. And in most parts of the country, Native people are not present. I mean, they were removed.
Yeah.
Or in other cases, like where I live in Kansas, the 3 tribes that we have in Kansas did not live in Kansas. I
Wow.
mean, for example, the Potawatomi were Great Lakes people from the forests pushed clear out to Kansas.
Right.
So we have
Right.
these incredible disconnects.
I think
That said,
sometimes about Geronimo and
yeah,
his Apache warriors ending up in Florida. It's like you couldn't have a
right,
more different landscape.
right, right. That said, there is tremendous revitalization happening almost with all tribes. Greater interest in recovering the language, definitely traditional ceremonies, which in most cases were continued even in the cover of darkness and somewhat
Mhm.
underground. Um, those ceremonies are still being practiced. It's encouraging to hear about them, and the interest is great. Um, but we're also talking about people who are so thoroughly subjugated that they're an impoverished class.
Yep.
So it's hard for them to take a financial lead, which is
Hmm.
a piece of this whole puzzle. Um, so it's hard to expect them to be leaders in this movement. There's interest, and in some places they can be leaders and do things. In all places, they could be leaders or co-leaders. And I would just encourage all of us to think of ways to continually outreach for collaboration. I do think collaboration is where it's at, and we've got to do that. We've got to think of ways to empower other people in what we do, because you will learn so much from them. And with Native Americans, um, all of them have deeper roots into our country than any of us European heritage folks, and we can learn from that. And that's important.
It can be kind of painful to watch as the science finally starts to swing around to merge with how these cultures viewed the landscape from the beginning. Like all that
Yeah.
damage that you discussed, all for nothing. It comes around, and we go like, oh, well, they were right about this. It's like it's just a hard reality to
Yes.
watch unfold. Tell me about big picture. What's your hopes for the prairie? What's your hopes for the North American landscape, for the future as people relate to plants and landscapes? Like big picture legacy for your work. Like
Yeah.
what are your hopes?
Well, I have great hope for younger people who something I've been involved in my whole life is the concept of bioregionalism, who focus on the region where they live
Hmm.
and who truly can make the steps to what I would view as re-inhabit it. And by that I mean come to know the place as it is, as its deep history is, and what it can become today, so that people get engaged in the landscape in terms of managing it, in bringing it back, in restoring it, in creating it, in using it in good ways and sustainable ways. I think that connection to place is something that all of us have experienced as important here during the pandemic. And I think we just need to drill deeper on that and think about ways that we in our communities can connect more with it. And in doing that, I think we're going to think of ways to be more sustainable in our energy use. Think about ways that we can incorporate, getting organic matter back into the soils of our area or region, of using trees and wood products, of getting food from the earth in ways that's more kind to the earth and to organisms, the soil, and ultimately to people.
Wow, I really agree with what you're saying, and it's really refreshing. I really have enjoyed talking with you today. Tell us where we can, how do you want people to access your books and other things, your videos, things like that, and
Yeah.
what can we expect? You said you've got some revisions to your books coming up.
Yes. Well, people can track me down pretty easily if you just go to the web and look for Native Plants, University of Kansas, and my name, Kelly Kindscher. You can get to my webpage. We have a extensive webpage development on medicinal plants and native plants. There's information there about my books. I'm really proud that I've published 100 papers, and almost all of them are available on that website.
Wow.
I'm delighted that my books are paperback and used. You can buy my edible and medicinal plant books cheap as used books. Really pleased about that. It's going to be a year or two before I get my revisions done on these works, but watch for them. They'll be out there. I need to get this information out. Want to get this information out. So, thank you. I very much enjoyed this conversation, and you've touched on many things that are close to my heart. And thank you.
Yeah, well, I'd love to have you back sometime and talk about some specific plants because I think you get, we talked pretty big picture today, and I feel your passion there, but I've also felt your passion drilled down to, individual plant level too. So it'd be fun to talk more about some of those things. And I just want to say that thank you for your contribution. I'm going to be bringing this book with me out to the Dakotas this summer. And I think it's going to be really, really helpful to me. So just thank you for the contribution you made to the world of wild food and, ecology in general. So it's just been a pleasure.
Yeah, you're welcome. And, there's nothing I love more than being out on the landscape, and I'm still a wanderer across the plains, and I might just run into you up there in the Dakotas. That's part of my territory.
All right. I'm going to try to make that happen. Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. Help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. If you still haven't seen season 1 of the WildFed TV show, you can go to myoutdoortv.com, grab yourself a free trial subscription, and then check out all 10 episodes. Season 2 of WildFed premieres on Outdoor Channel in early 2022. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out our store for WildFed hats, stickers, and more. WildFed. Food is all around you.